Hi guys, welcome back to the videos. Today we're going to be discussing two of the triangle congruence theorems that you have to know, the SSS and the SAS theorem. Whenever you see these theorems, when you see S, that stands for the side of a triangle. When you see A, that stands for the angle of a triangle. So we're going to split the video up into two parts today. The first part I'll do SSS, the second part I'll do SAS. And today, if you've already previewed through your notes, you see that we're going to be doing a lot of proofs. So what I did was I took a little screenshot of this reference sheet that I'm going to give to you guys on Monday or Tuesday. So that way we could help write our proofs with the reasons that are given here. So yeah, let's just go on from there. I have already filled this in for you. And it says, if three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent themselves. And I know that seems very obvious, like duh, if three sides of a triangle are congruent to three sides of another, then clearly the triangles are the same. But it is in fact a theorem you have to know. And you get really lucky if this is a question like on the EOC or on the exam, because SSS is probably the easiest one. All right. So let's do some proofs. The key thing that I always teach students is when you do proofs with congruent triangles, and when you're trying to prove that two triangles are congruent, what you need to do is mark up your figure with all the given information and anything else that the figure tells you. So, for example, in number one, it says that PQ is congruent to ST. We also know that QR is congruent to RT. And then it tells us that R is the midpoint of PS. And the thing about that is, okay, so here's PS. R is the midpoint of it. You already know that a midpoint cuts a segment into two congruent parts. So that means that this PR, side PR, must be congruent to side RS. So clearly, if you look at the two figures, they have three sides that are congruent to three sides of another triangle. So we're going to use the SSS here. All right. So we get real lucky because here the first three pieces of information are given to us. And then the fourth piece of information says PR is congruent to RS. And that is because of the midpoint. All right, and then finally, now that we've established that we have three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of another triangle, we say that those triangles are congruent. All right? And you know those triangles are congruent because of the SSS theorem. Okay? So, proof two. We are given that JL is congruent to MN. And we are also given that K is the midpoint of JN, which if that's true, then we know that JK must be congruent to KN. And then it's also the midpoint of segment LM. So LK must be congruent to KM by the midpoint definition as well. Okay, so the first two are given here. And we know that JK is congruent to KN because of the definition of a midpoint. So I'm just going to put little checks next to the sides that we've established are congruent. It actually might be better. Instead of doing check marks, let's make it more meaningful. Let's put S, S, okay? And then we could say that LK is congruent to KM. That as well is the definition of a midpoint. So we have a third side that is congruent. So the only logical theorem that would work here is the SSS theorem. Okay. And finally, proof 3, before we move on to SAS. Here's what we're given. AC is congruent to AD. CB is congruent to BD. And then if you look here, these two triangles are touching. They share a side. And so here's that side that they share. They share AB. And therefore, the triangles share the side AB, so AB must be congruent to itself. And I know that seems pretty silly, but you know, it's just one of those things that we have to establish to be very thorough in our logic. And remember, that's the reflexive property. When in math, if something is congruent to itself, we say that's because of the reflexive property. All right. So let's, this one is more difficult because they don't give us the statements. However, we're in luck because we are already given some good stuff. And we know that the proof statement, that always has to go last. And we don't have any midpoints here, so we can't use midpoint like we did in the previous two. But we do know that AB is congruent to itself. And the reason why that's true is because of the reflexive property. And therefore, we have three sides that are congruent to one another. So these two triangles are congruent by the SSS theorem.